I've always been a fan of peaceful getaways to disconnect from everything. So when my friend Claire suggested a weekend at a remote Airbnb cabin, I thought it was the perfect idea. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, and the place was exactly like the photos. Cozy, with large windows letting in sunlight that reflected off the fresh snow outside. We spent the first evening cooking, chatting, and later relaxing in the outdoor hot tub. The sense of peace was indescribable. Just the falling snow and absolute silence all around us. The cabin was far from any nearby town, so the whole point was to enjoy the isolation. The host had been clear in his messages. The place was safe, well-maintained, and no one ever came by without notice. Everything seemed perfect until we returned from the hot tub. We stepped inside, still laughing at some silly joke, but the laughter died the moment we walked through the door. The living room was completely turned upside down. Literally, chairs were toppled over, the sofa had been pushed into the center of the room, and the cabinet doors were open with kitchen items scattered across the floor. Claire froze in the doorway, clutching her towel tightly around her, as if paralyzed. "Did you lock the door when we left?" she asked in almost a whisper. I was sure I had. The lock was simple, but I distinctly remembered turning the key before we went outside. Yet, there were no footprints in the snow outside, no sign of forced entry. That's when the unease began to set in. We stood frozen at the entrance for a few moments, staring at the mess, trying to process what we were seeing. My first thought was that someone must have broken in, but at the same time, nothing made sense. The snow outside was untouched, with no footprints other than our own leading to the hot tub. Claire suggested it might have been an animal, but there were no broken windows or signs of forced entry. Besides, the mess didn't look like something an animal would make. It was too methodical, as if someone had deliberately opened the cabinets and scattered things on the floor. I walked over to the door to check if it was still locked, and it was. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered, trying to hide my growing nervousness. But it was impossible to ignore the feeling that something very wrong had happened. After staring at the scene for a while, we decided we needed to check every corner of the cabin to make sure no one was inside. The idea made me even more tense, but it was better to face it head-on than let our imaginations run wild. We searched all the rooms, the bathrooms, and even the larger closets, but found nothing. No signs that anyone else had been there besides us. Still, the mess was undeniable, and the longer I looked at it, the more uncomfortable I became. Why would someone do this? And how could there be no footprints in the snow? We decided to tidy up the living room to distract ourselves, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that the cabin no longer felt as welcoming as it had when we first arrived. It was as if all the peace we'd felt had evaporated. After cleaning up as best we could, we sat in the living room trying to come up with a logical explanation. The idea that someone might have come in was unsettling but made more sense than any other theory. We started mentally reviewing everything we'd done since arriving. Did I lock the door? Yes, absolutely. Did we hear any noise while we were outside? No. And the snow? No tracks except ours. Still, it was impossible to ignore what was right in front of us. Claire suggested that maybe we'd made a mistake, that the door hadn't been locked after all, and someone had come in and left before the snow started falling harder. It was plausible, but it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. If someone had come in, why mess everything up and not take anything? Even though the cabin seemed empty, we decided we couldn't relax without taking more precautions. We placed a chair against the front door and stacked a few items near the windows. Not exactly practical, but it gave us a small sense of security. The host had said the place was safe, but how could we be sure? We couldn't stop thinking that someone might have done this deliberately, maybe as a sick joke or worse, to scare us. We spent hours in the living room, speaking in hushed tones and glancing at the door with every creak or groan of the wooden floor. I'd been through uncomfortable situations before, but nothing that had ever left me feeling this exposed and vulnerable. The next morning, after barely sleeping, we decided to go outside and walk around the cabin. More to feel like we were doing something than because we expected to find anything. But as we turned the corner of the porch, Claire suddenly stopped and pointed to the snow. There, near one of the side windows, were footprints. Human footprints. What made my blood run cold was that they seemed to come from deeper in the woods. where the snow was thicker, as if someone had walked through the surrounding forest to get to the cabin. They weren't boot prints like ours, but the impression of regular sneakers, sunken into the soft snow. The worst part? The tracks led up to the living room window and then back into the woods. Someone had been there during the night, watching. We rushed back inside the cabin as quickly as we could, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. It explained a lot, but also made everything more terrifying. Claire wanted to call the host and the police immediately, but we were in the middle of nowhere with barely any cell service. When we finally reached the host, he sounded genuinely shocked and apologized profusely, saying he'd never heard of anything like this happening at the property before. The police? They said it would be hard to investigate without solid evidence or stolen property, suggesting it might have been someone curious passing through. But we knew it wasn't that simple. Who crosses a snowy forest to spy on two women in an isolated cabin, leaving the place in disarray but taking nothing? We decided we couldn't stay another night, so we packed our things as quickly as possible. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Every little noise outside seemed magnified, as if someone might appear at any moment. While Claire packed the last of our bags, I went to the living room to grab my coat. That's when I saw something that made me freeze. On the floor, near the window where we'd seen the footprints, was a crumpled piece of paper that hadn't been there before. I picked it up carefully, my heart racing. It was a page torn from a regular notebook, with something hastily written on it. "I'll be back." I showed it to Claire without saying a word, and the panic hit us like a wave. This wasn't just a theory anymore. Someone had been there and knew exactly where we were. Without wasting another second, we threw our bags in the car and left as fast as we could. The drive back to the main road felt endless, with the tall trees and snow-covered ground closing in around us. Claire didn't say a word the entire ride, and I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. When we finally reached the nearest town, we went straight to a hotel and called the police again, this time with the note in hand. They filed a report but didn't seem optimistic about finding the person responsible. The whole experience left me with a lingering unease that I've never been able to shake. The thought of someone invading that space, watching us, and leaving a deliberate message still haunts me. Since that day, I've never stayed in a place that remote again. I'm still not entirely sure how to start this because I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that weekend. My friends and I, me, Mark, Julie, and Anna, decided to rent a cabin far away from the city to escape the chaos of our daily lives. On paper, the place was perfect. Isolated, surrounded by trees, and with that cozy country house vibe. We arrived on Friday afternoon and spent the day exploring the cabin and joking about how it felt like the setting for a horror movie. Everything seemed normal until night fell. It was around 11 when it started pouring rain. We gathered in the living room to play cards and drink wine, and before heading to bed, I personally went to check the front door. I turned the key twice and pulled the handle to make sure it was locked. Everything was secure. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise that sent chills down my spine. It was the sound of the front door creaking open, the hinges groaning in the quiet cabin. My first reaction was to convince myself I was imagining it. But when the sound of rain outside synced with the movement of the wood, I realized it was real. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and stepped into the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I peeked at the front door and saw, to my horror, that it was ajar. I rushed to close it, the rain soaking my shirt as I stood there. I paused for a moment, trying to hear any sign that someone was nearby, but all I could hear was the rain and the wind rustling the trees. I shut the door and checked the lock 3 more times before heading back to my room, trying to convince myself that maybe I hadn't locked it properly earlier. The next morning, I woke up with a lingering sense of unease. I couldn't shake off what had happened during the night, but I didn't want to come across as paranoid in front of my friends. Over breakfast, I decided to mention the door, only to discover that no one else had heard anything. But then Mark, my best friend, gave me a strange look. He hesitated before saying, "Dude, are you okay? Because last night we had a conversation, and it was kind of weird." I froze in confusion. I told him I hadn't talked to anyone, that I'd gone straight back to bed after closing the door. He insisted, saying I had walked into his room and started talking about a distant relative of mine, someone I barely remembered. A chill ran down my spine. I explained to him that it was impossible because I hadn't left my room again after closing the door. The strangest part was the detail Mark gave about the supposed conversation. He said I'd spoken seriously, almost in a trance, about this great uncle, a relative I barely knew existed. In fact, I wasn't even sure if the man was still alive. The atmosphere around the table became heavy, but no one wanted to dwell on the subject. The day went on, but the feeling that something was wrong lingered. Late that afternoon, I got a call from my mom, and my stomach dropped as soon as she started talking. She told me that my great-uncle, the same one Mark had mentioned, had passed away that night, almost at the exact time Mark claimed I'd been talking about him. Felt like the world stopped for a moment. To this day, I can't comprehend how that's even possible. After I hung up, I stood there, my mind racing. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. I told my friends about the call, and Mark looked visibly shaken. He repeated that he wasn't making it up, that I had really entered his room and talked about my great-uncle. He even described details of what I supposedly said, including my uncle's full name and a story about a farm he'd owned in his youth. Details I didn't even know. Julie, ever the rational one, suggested that maybe Mark had dreamed it and confused things. But the serious tone in his voice and the look in his eyes told me he wasn't lying. It was real to him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Later that afternoon, we decided to go for a walk around the property, hoping it would ease the tension. The place was beautiful, but everything felt more sinister now. The trees seemed taller, the silence heavier, and a light drizzle only added to the eerie atmosphere. As we walked, Anna suddenly stopped and pointed at something on the ground. It was an old, rusty key, partially buried in the mud. None of us could figure out how it had ended up there. Julie suggested it might have been left behind by the previous owners of the cabin. We tried to laugh it off, but the key felt out of place, as if it didn't belong there. I picked it up and put it in my pocket, unsure why, but something told me it would matter later. When we got back to the cabin, the vibe inside had shifted. Felt colder, darker, even with all the lights on. I took the key out of my pocket and placed it on the living room table. Just looking at it made me uneasy, like it wasn't just an ordinary object. Mark, already on edge, said the key was starting to freak him out. Julie, trying to stay logical, suggested it might belong to a hidden compartment in the cabin and that there was nothing to be afraid of. But Anna muttered that we shouldn't have touched it, that we should have left it where we found it. The tension grew, and I realized the rain outside had picked up again, the sound of the drops on the roof growing louder and louder. That's when the lights flickered. It was just for a second, but it was enough to make everyone freeze. We instinctively gathered in the living room, as if staying together would protect us. Then we heard a sound from the kitchen. Slow, dragging footsteps, heavy enough to make the wooden floor creak. No one moved. Mark looked at me and said, "You heard that, right?" I nodded, trying not to panic. Julie aimed her phone's flashlight toward the kitchen, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, yet the sound continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My chest tightened, and everyone seemed to feel the same suffocating fear. Anna started whispering that we needed to leave, but where could we go in the middle of a storm? We stayed frozen, staring at the kitchen as the footsteps continued. And then they stopped. Silence fell, so complete it was deafening. Even the rain seemed to pause for a moment. That's when we heard the front door creak open again. The same sound I'd heard the night before, but this time we were all awake to witness it. We ran to the door, and there it was, ajar once more. The strangest part? No one heard the lock turn or the door being forced open. Mark slammed it shut and locked it again, but any sense of security was long gone. Whatever was happening, it was clear something didn't want us there. Minutes later, the sound started again, this time coming from upstairs. Faster now, like someone running back and forth. Mark and I climbed the stairs together, Julie and Anna close behind. When we reached the top, the footsteps stopped. The hallway was empty, and all the bedroom doors were open, just as we'd left them. That's when Mark noticed muddy footprints on the floor, going from room to room. But none of us had been upstairs since we got back. The silence was unbearable, and no matter how hard we tried to make sense of it, the truth was clear. Something or someone was in that cabin with us. We hurried back downstairs, the fear on everyone's faces unmistakable. When we reached the living room, the key I'd left on the table was gone. "Where did you put it?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. I swore it had been right there. We searched the entire cabin, but the key had vanished. Julie, who had been trying to stay calm all day, finally snapped. "This doesn't make any sense. Either someone's messing with us, or something's seriously wrong here." No one replied, but we all knew it wasn't a prank. The discomfort was suffocating, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Then we heard it again. A noise, but this time from the basement. The problem? None of us even knew the cabin had a basement. We looked at each other in disbelief, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was down there. Mark argued we should leave immediately, but Julie insisted we check. "What if it's just an animal?" she said, though it was clear she didn't believe it. Armed with phone flashlights and whatever courage we had left, we opened a door hidden in the kitchen. A narrow, damp staircase led down into darkness, the smell of mold hitting us like a wall. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if something was trying to pull us back. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark's flashlight illuminated something that made my heart nearly stop. In the center of the basement was a small wooden table, and on it sat the rusty key. Around the table, marks on the ground formed a crude circle, as if someone had drawn them hastily or deliberately. The silence in the basement was different from the rest of the cabin. It was thick, almost tangible, swallowing any sound we made. Anna clung to my arm, trembling, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. But I couldn't move. There was something about that key, that circle, that held me in place. Staring at it felt like the only thing I could do. Suddenly, we heard the kitchen door creak upstairs. Everyone froze. The door we just locked was open again, and this time, we heard footsteps descending the stairs. Slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was knew exactly where we were. Julie pointed her flashlight at the staircase, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. No one moved. The air in the basement felt like it was being sucked out, leaving us gasping. When the footsteps stopped, the silence that followed was unbearable. We waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing appeared. Still, the oppressive weight of a presence filled the room. Whatever was there didn't show itself, but we knew it was real. I don't know how we found the courage, but we bolted upstairs and knew we couldn't stay another second in that cabin. Grabbing our belongings haphazardly, we ran to the car. The rain was relentless, the dirt road a muddy mess, but nothing seemed worse than staying in that place. Mark floored the gas and we drove away without looking back. The silence in the car was almost as heavy as it had been in the basement. No one spoke. We were all lost in our thoughts. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone chasing us. But the road behind us remained empty. Finally, as we neared the main road, Anna broke the silence. The key. It was still there. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. She was right. We had left the key in the basement. We never returned to that cabin, and we've avoided talking about what happened there. As much as I want answers, part of me knows it's better to leave it alone. Mark and I never spoke again about the supposed conversation he said we had that night, and the rest of us avoided mentioning the strange occurrences. But the most unsettling thing happened a few days later. I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was an old, faded photograph of a key identical to the one we found at the cabin. There was no sender, no note. Since then, I can't shake the feeling that, somehow, this isn't over, and maybe it never will be. I've always enjoyed nighttime games at camp, especially on the last night, when everything feels a little more fun and the looming goodbyes make the atmosphere bittersweet. That summer, on our last day at camp, my friends and I decided to play hide and seek after dinner. The moonlight was bright enough to keep us from tripping over anything, and the rule was clear. No going into the buildings, just hiding outside. When it was my turn, I chose to hide near the dining hall, behind a stack of chairs. It seemed like the perfect spot, quiet, slightly out of the way, and with a good vantage point to watch everyone else. I stayed there for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the forest in the distance and trying to control my breathing to avoid being found. It was fun, until I realized I'd been hiding for too long, and no one had come to find me. When I finally decided to leave my hiding spot and look for the others, I found the group gathered near the sports field, their faces filled with concern. Before I could say anything, my friend Leo practically shouted, "Were you messing with us? Why did you run toward the cabin and then disappear?" I froze, confused. I was certain I hadn't left the dining hall area. I tried to explain that I'd been hiding the whole time, but they started arguing among themselves, swearing they'd seen me, or someone who looked just like me, run silently toward cabin 3, which had been empty all week. My heart started racing. If it wasn't me they saw, then who was it? Curiosity and unease quickly took over the group. We decided to check out cabin 3. Despite putting on a brave face, the tension was palpable. The cabin was more isolated than the others, and no one had been assigned to it that week. We walked together, flashlights in hand, as the silence of the forest seemed to grow heavier with each step. When we arrived, the door was closed but unlocked, which was already strange. Unused cabins were always kept locked. We pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the wood sounding louder than usual. Inside, everything appeared as expected. Empty bunks, neatly arranged mattresses, but the air felt colder than it should. We searched the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. At least that's what we thought. Just as we were about to leave, Clara, my best friend, pointed out something in the corner of one of the bunks. It was a dark gray hoodie lying on the floor, with a logo none of us recognized. I picked it up and immediately noticed two things. First, no one in our group owned a hoodie like that, and second, it was completely dry, even though everything outside was damp from the evening dew. Leo tried to joke, saying it was probably just left behind by someone, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. Who could have left it there? The cabin had been vacant for days. That's when the idea started to form in all of our minds. If it wasn't from anyone in our group, then someone else had to have been there. Someone who might have used our game as a cover to stay unnoticed. We left the cabin quickly, though no one wanted to admit they were scared. The thought of someone wandering around unnoticed was too unsettling to ignore. We made our way back to the main part of camp, constantly glancing over our shoulders. Clara carried the hoodie like it was evidence, something we could show the camp counselors if needed. But there was something strange about it too. As we walked, she commented that it looked almost brand new, like it had just been bought. That made my stomach turn. Why would someone bring a brand new hoodie to a remote camp? And why leave it behind? Everything about the situation felt too deliberate, as if whoever left it wanted us to find it. When we got back to the main group, we decided to tell the counselors what had happened. They didn't seem as concerned as we were. They shrugged it off, saying it could have been left by a previous group or maybe a prank by someone from another camp. But we knew that didn't make sense. The area around cabin 3 had almost no footprints, and no one was supposed to be there that week. For the rest of the night, we stayed near the campfire, keeping watch over the dark forest and trying to figure out who, or what, could have used our game as a chance to sneak around. Nothing else happened, but no one could relax. The silence around us felt heavier than it had any other night, as if we were being watched by someone or something we couldn't see. The next morning, the relief of seeing the sunrise was immediate. The daylight seemed to lift some of the unease from the night before, but none of us could forget what had happened. Clara handed the hoodie to one of the head counselors, who promised to look into it, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. Probably just something left behind by a previous camper, he said with a casual smile, as if it were just another forgotten item. But we knew better. It was impossible to ignore the inconsistencies. The hoodie was dry, the cabin should have been locked, and someone definitely had been seen going inside. None of it added up. Before we left, Clara and I decided to take one last look around cabin 3. We wanted to see if we'd missed something, maybe footprints or any other clue. What we found only made us more uneasy. Near the cabin, in the dirt by the window that faced the bunks, were faint impressions, like someone had been standing there for a long time. They didn't match our own footprints. They were lighter, as if made by someone wearing thin-soled shoes, maybe regular sneakers. That erased any lingering doubts. Someone had been there, and the worst part? It seemed like they'd been watching us. Clara turned pale and insisted we leave immediately. As we boarded the bus to go home, I finally felt a small sense of relief, but deep down, I knew I'd never feel completely safe in isolated places again. On the way home, no one in the group wanted to talk about what had happened. It was like we'd silently agreed to forget about that night. Clara and I exchanged a few words about the hoodie, but the conversation didn't go far. When I got home, she texted me, saying she dreamed about the cabin and woke up feeling like someone was still watching her. I tried not to dwell on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling either. For days, I replayed everything in my mind, trying to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. Who was the person they saw entering the cabin? Why were they there? And why didn't they take anything or do more than just leave that hoodie behind? Even now, whenever someone talks about nighttime games at camp, I think of that night. I don't know if it was just a curious stranger, someone trying to blend in, or something more sinister. All I know is that the idea of being in a remote place, where anyone could show up unnoticed, has never felt the same to me. I can't stop wondering what might have happened if we'd stayed in that cabin longer or if whoever it was had decided to show themselves. Sometimes, I catch myself thinking, were they watching us the whole time we were investigating? Did they stay hidden until the very last moment? I don't have the answers, but one thing is certain. I've never played hide and seek at night again, and I don't think I ever will.